Okay, good day everyone. My name is Reiko Jemima Bastian and I'll be discussing the origin and meaning of traditional literary criticism. Let's start from the origin. Where did traditional literary criticism came from? So there were actually two main traditional Greek systems of criticism in the past. It was Aristotelian and Platonic. Aristotelian criticism determines the value of a work according to its logical and formal qualities. That is, it is criticism of the work itself with no relation to other aspects of life, and it was more objective. While Platonic criticism determines the value of the work in relation to life and more subjective. These two, Aristotelian and Platonic criticisms, have influenced subsequent developments in theory and criticism in different ways. That is generally where and when Western literary criticism in theory is said to have begun. But a more modern concept of traditional literary criticism is the judging and defining of a literary canon. What do we say if we say literary canon or canon itself? The canon is a group of literary works selected by scholars as the best representation of that country's or community's most valued literary works. At a A traditional American literary canon, for example, contains the likes of Hawthorne, Whitman, Emerson, Dickinson, Twain, Fitzgerald, and so on. With the rise of cultural theory including feminism, race theory, deconstruction, and new historicism, the traditional canon has changed to include more works by female and minority writers, thus giving the canon a more accurate representation of American writers and culture. Lastly, a traditional literary criticism was more of a linear history of that canon. The canon and criticism became more modern with the inclusion of new writers, as well as with the advent of those literary theories such as deconstruction, new historicism, and post-structuralism, which assess literary works using outside resources, such as psychoanalysis, language theories, and cultural theories. In this PowerPoint, these are the keywords or phrases that can be easily understood if we talk about the origin of traditional literary criticism. This time we'll be discussing the meaning of traditional literary criticism. We'll be discussing only four. So always remember, if we talk about the meaning of this traditional literary criticism, it has the word analyze and author's life and works. So yeah, we'll be discussing the first one. It says here, analyzes how the author's life is shown in the work. Second one, the author may choose to include events, people, or places to serve as influences in their literary work, also their characteristics, thought, and emotion. It also questions how the work shows pieces of the author's past, his or her interest, biases, and etc. Lastly, it takes the humanist view and looks for both technical skills and significant content for re-representation of themes that belong to the great commonplaces of human existence. Again, um, I've discussed the origin and meaning of traditional literary criticism. These are the keywords here. So, Miss Novi Ann will be discussing the traditional literary theories. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day.
I am Novi Bigakawan and I will be discussing the theories of the traditional literary criticism. Number one is the literary theory. Literary theory is the bodies of ideas and methods that are used in the practical reading of literature. This also referring to the theories that can reveal what literature can mean. So, in literary theories, it formulates the relationship between author and work, wherein it develops the significance of race, class, and gender for literary studies and to the biography of the author. Literary, literary theory also offers varying approaches for understanding the role of historical context in interpretation, as well as the relevance of linguistic and unconscious elements of the text. It explained the degree to which text is more on the culture than the individual author, and that's when it turns how those texts help to create the culture. Next one is the critical literary theory. In critical literary theory, it provides more valid readings of literature wherein interpretations should draw upon the writings of major social, linguistic, anthropological, philosophical, or psychological theorists. Each text must be understood in terms of social, political, and ideological production and reception. Literature is also involved in the ideological and material practices and social relationships of both its contemporary and modern readers. In this theory, a text is not produced by the authors but by the readers. The readers are the one of the constituent components of which was a critic of the instrumental use in advanced capitalist culture. Next one is the Marxist literary theory. In Marxist literary theory, theories are more focused on the representation of class conflict as well as the reinforcement of class distinctions through the medium of literature. Marxist theorists Marxist theorists use traditional techniques of literary analysis but subordinate aesthetics concerns to the final social and political meanings of literature. Literary theories arising from Marxist paradigm have not only found new ways of understanding the relationship between economic production and literature, but all cultural production as well. Next is the New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. In New Historicism and Cultural Materialism, it seeks to understand literary text historically, and they reject the formalizing influence of literary studies. According to New Historicism, the circulation of literary and non-literary texts produces relations of social power within a culture. They said that we can only know the textual history of the past because it is embedded, wherein the text and context are less clearly distinct in new historists' practice. They take particular interest in representation of marginal and marginalized groups and non-normative behaviors and draw on the work of Levi-Strauss, in particular his notion of culture as a self-regulating system. Next is the historical biographical traditional approach. In historical biographical traditional approach, this approach sees the work simply as a reflection of the author's life and times or the life of the times or the life and times of the characters in work. This approach has been evolving several over centuries. The next one and the last, moral philosophical approach. In the moral philosophical approach, this approach emphasized moralism and utilitarianism. The basic position of such critique is that the larger function of the literary or literature is to teach morality and to provide philosophical issues. They would interpret literature within the text of the period. Matthew Arnold, who is the Victorian critic, insisted that a great literary work must possess high seriousness. Moralists consider form, figurative language, and other aesthetic considerations as secondary. Moral or philosophical teaching is more important. It seems reasonable to use traditional methods to get the total meaning of a work of art. It is also has avoided occultism and faddism. It has preserved scholarly discipline in literary criticism. And that is the theories of the traditional literary criticism. Let's move on to the examples of traditional literary criticism. Number one example is The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn. This book is a great example of traditional criticism. The introduction of this book goes over how Mark Twain's life affected his writing. Number two example is the John Press, The Fire and the Fountain. It is an essay on poetry that published on 1995. The purpose of this book is to estimate the significance of this moment for the poem and to trace the way that a poem grows in his mind. Number three is the Christine Brooks Roses A ZBC of Ezra Pound, published on 1971. The book of Christine Brooke expects readers to be familiar with the entirety of the Pound corpus, including his criticism and essay writing, and with the major prior scholarship concerning his work. Number four is the Anthony Twaite's 20th Century English Poetry. It is an introduction and published on 1978. This book provided a guide to the poetry of the first half of this century. The author discusses the general condition of poetry and then the work of all major poets. Number five is the Blake Morrison's The Movement, the English and fiction of the 1950s, that is published on 1989. This book is Blake's first published book, wherein he explores the early careers of a group of mostly still active writers, and the result is a model of literary history at once scholarly and exceptionally readable. Number six is the X. J. Kennedy and Dana Giowas on an introduction to poetry, that is published on 1994. This book has a poem from the classic era all the way to the modern and gives example about the poetic devices. It is also an introduction to poetry and explores the elements of poetry. Another one is the John Lennard's The Poetry Handbook, a guide to reading poetry for pleasure and practical criticism, that is published on 1996. This is an entertaining guide to the poet's craft and an invaluable introduction to practical criticism. Another is Tom Furness and Michael Batts Reading Poetry, that is published on 1996. Reading poetry offers a comprehensive, accessible guide to the art of reading poetry. The successive chapters introduce case skills and critical or theoretical issues. Number 9 is the Mark Stroud and Evan Boland's The Making of a Poem, a Norton anthology or poetic forms, that is published on 2000. In this book, the poet has collaborated on this intimate and useful anthology illuminating the history, practice, and wonder of our most elusive art. Next is the William Langland's Piers Plowman. This book is an attack on the corruption of 14th century English life. And the last one is the Walton Scott's Ivanhoe and Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. This book can be better understood by readers who understood the Anglo-Norman times for French Revolution. And that are the examples of traditional literary criticism.
Hi everyone, my name is Charmaine Campos and I'm going to report or discuss about the purpose of traditional literary criticism. So let's proceed. For the first one, it takes the humanist view. In here, it only wants to explain or imply that traditional literary criticism questions the existence of the characters on the poetry. And for the second one, it is concerned about the content of the poetry. So it means that it is not overtly or rigidly moralistic. It doesn't need judgment and it's not strictly observed. Or the last one, it does not paraphrase a poem to extract its message. In here, you don't need to change or shorten the poem. Hence, it does see as a holding up some mirror to nature. A poem is valued for its ability to provide heightened intellectual or emotional experience like no other. Thank you.
So, lastly is the traditional literary criticism K question. So, what literature was, why we read literature, and what we read. So, a reader who stays more or less on the surface of a piece of literature has at least understood part of what is about it. So, uh, having these questions help us understand what the text explain and what the author intends us to know about it. So, uh, before proceeding to new historicism questions, new historicism has been broken down into two parts. The old criticism that started in 1930s to 1960s, wherein it uses history in biography, in interpreting a literary work. It believes that historian can write objectively, while the new criticism from 1980s up to present, it believed that history is subjective and it is shaped by the people who live it. So, proceeding to the question for traditional historian, they ask what happened. So, this tells events happen in the history to provide information that shows how literary texts were perceived in their time. So, um, it looks at events in writer's life to see personal influences from the work. It shows how literary text reflects ideas in attitude uh, of the time in which they are written. Next is what does the event tell us about history? So, every literary work is a product of its time and its world. Understanding the social background and the intellectual currents of that time and that world illuminate literary works for later generation of the readers. So next is the Marxist criticism. So Marxist criticism believes that literature is one form of cultural production of a complex society and as such reflects the forces shaping the society's culture. So in other words, literature is not only a mirror which reflects society, but it is also a dynamic participant in shaping the culture. So, proceeding to the question, first questions is whom does it, the work, the effort, the policy, and the road, etc. benefit? So, is it the elite? Is it the middle class? And so on. So, Marxist critics are also interested on how lower or working class are opposed in everyday life and in literature, since it concerns itself from class differences, economics, as well as the implications and complications of the capitalist system. Next question is whom does it benefit if the work or effort is accepted, successful, believed, and etc. So next is what is the social class of the author? Does he or she belong to the bourgeoisie or the capitalist or the proletariat class? These are the worker uh, on the lower class. So next question is what values does it reinforce? So since this is a Marxist theory, it values are based on labor. So next question, what values does it subvert or ruin? Next, what conflict can be seen between the values and the work champions and those it portrays? Next, what social classes do the characters represent? And next, how do the characters are from different classes interact or conflict? So, uh, in conclusion, Marxist theory criticism prioritized when it analyzed literature first is the economic status of the character, second is the class conflict, third is the oppression based on wealth, access to economic privileges or lack thereof.